Hi, my name is Paul, and welcome to the first video in our series on internationalization in Next.js. In this series, we're going to take you from the absolute basics, which we plan to cover in this video, all the way to full-on enterprise level, you're ready for anything type internationalization. And I want to start off by discussing why we're making this series. This is a fairly large topic, and while there are a number of very good videos on the basics of internationalization in Next.js, we haven't found anything that goes anywhere near as far as we intend to in this series. And it's a pretty big topic, and there's a lot more that you need to know about how to do this properly than just adding a locale file or a number of locale files to your project. Next, I want to talk just a bit about the history of internationalization in Next.js and where things currently stand. Internationalization was released as a feature of Next.js in version 10, and that was about 3 years ago at this point. At that point, it was more or less built into the framework as a core competency. It was a first-class citizen, you might say. And what that means is that even core elements of the framework, like the link component and the router, accepted a locale as params, meaning that the architecture of the platform or of the framework was aware of this concept and would do things on that basis. Now, all of this changed when Next.js released the app router in version 13. As of this recording, we're at about 14.1 off the top of my head. So the big change here is that while the documentation for Next still references internationalization and gives you ideas about how to do it in your application, it was pretty much removed as a competency of the framework itself. And I think this was the right choice. The reason being, if you think about the functional component of internationalizing your site, at least at its basics, all that really needs to happen at the most basic level of your application is that when a user arrives to your route that begins with /en, for instance, you would show content in English, whereas when a route begins with NL, you would show them content in Dutch. So that's not necessarily something that needs to be managed at the framework level, especially if you want to customize it. Which is actually why in this series, we intend to start from the absolute basics and not use any external packages for internationalization, because it's very important that you understand the absolute rudiments of how it works in your application. Therefore, you have total freedom to make any changes to the behavior of the way your application internationalizes its content that you would like to make at any point. So we're going to dive in here in just a moment after a quick intro from me. As I said, my name is Paul. I'm the founder of Render. We are a custom product and software development studio. If you have web application needs, reach out to us using the link in the description. That said, let's jump in. Okay, we are ready to scaffold out our Next.js application. I'm just going to accept all the defaults here. We'll pop this open in VS Code. And real quick, just fire up the app. Let's take a quick look and make sure that everything works as expected. It does. Great. So let's jump into the app directory here and go ahead and create a dynamic route segment. If you don't already know, a dynamic route segment will pass the value that you create here as a parameter to your route. So we want to move everything but the fav icon into this new directory. And let's go ahead and start making use of our new lang parameter. And we'll pass this directly to our HTML element to properly set the lang attribute. So what's going on here? Why do we have a 404? Well, we've told the application that we always expect for there to be something at the very root of the project by moving our most close to the root of the project layout and page directory or page files to this lang directory. So we need to take our first steps on implementing this according to the Next.js docs. But before we do that, I just want to show you a few changes I'm going to make on the configuration in tsconfig.json. So that we can easily use alias imports, I'm just going to copy in something here. So these are going to be where our constants and components live in this project. It'll just make it so we don't have to look at all of this every time we import a component. Okay. That said, let's continue. Now, as I mentioned, Next.js does still have documentation on internationalization. It's fairly brief though. So we're going to grab what we need out of it, and I'll just point out a few things that I think are not quite optimal on how this is set up right now. But the first thing we need to do is create a middleware.ts file. So we're going to grab this, and as you see here, we need to install a couple of packages. So let's jump back over here. Okay, fire up the app again. Actually, before we do that, we're going to see that after we do that, Negotiator is still going to complain. So we want to install these types as well. And now we'll fire up the application again. Okay, no more type issues there. So jumping back into the Next.js docs, we're going to run into a bit of an inconsistency here. They just document that you can manage all the stuff that's going on here at the top of the file to match the user's locale in a different way. This, I believe, used to be included in the documentation. It is no longer, and so I'm just going to clean this up a little bit here. And where they were previously calling get locale, we're just going to call match. Okay, so let's see if things have improved. All right, so we see our content again, but you see that we've been redirected to /en-us. Now, the reason that happened here is because we check if the path name has a locale, and if it does have a locale, we're just going to return the request. If it doesn't, we're going to redirect the user to the page with the locale that matches their browser. Note, of course, that we are excluding this middleware from running on all of the static Next resources like CSS and JavaScript. Okay, so let's note a couple of things here. See how we have the strings hard-coded into the application? That's fine and it works, but there's actually a better approach that we can take. So let's take a look at that now. The first thing I want to do in our app directory, actually, I'm going to do this at the root of the project. Doesn't make a huge difference actually, but it's just preference. I'm going to make a constants directory, and in it, I'm going to create a file called locales.ts. And in this file, we're going to export two variables. One of them is going to be locales, which as you can, I'm sure, imagine, is going to be an array. But we're actually going to make this an array of objects, and this will make more sense in future videos. For this example, we are going to be using English and Dutch. And then let's also declare what our default locale is, and for this project, it'll be EM, and then English, I should say. We are going to export both of these. Okay, and then we also want to make an i18n config. And we will just paste this in here. Now, you may wonder why we have similar information declared in this file as we do have in our constants file. That'll make more sense as we go through the project, but for now, just think of the locales in the i18n config here as being a smaller version of the information that will exist in locales as we continue to expand the project. So we want to go ahead and import default locale from our locales file, and we want to import i18n from our config, and we'll get rid of the imports that we no longer need, and we'll just need to update these two as coming from i18n, and we're set. We're in exactly the same shape as we were before. You can see that we have our application running on /nl and /en. Great. Now, one thing to point out here is that we have already made a decision in that we are deciding that there is effectively no default locale for the project, in that we go to localhost 3000 /en for the English content and /nl for the Dutch content. You have to decide what's appropriate for your application. The setup that Next.js gives us in their documentation is great, but I want to show you an alternative. Okay, so I've pasted in here another option for how we can handle things. If we decide that we do want to have a default locale, and so for instance, not show /en if the user is browsing the site in English, we can do this here. So basically, we are going to have two if statements that make a distinction between a redirect and a rewrite. If you don't already know, a redirect is when you change the path that's actually shown in the address bar of the user, whereas a rewrite allows for the content of the address bar to be anything you like, but it tells Next.js that the request should be handled by the part of the application that you are rewriting to. So for instance, if a user comes in here and they are on a page whose path starts with a default locale or is the default locale, we're going to do a redirect. We emphasize this in the comment here, a redirect to send them to that same path without that default locale as part of it. And then this is going to rerun again because this request will come through and it's then going to look and see if the path name is missing a locale, which now it is. And so it's going to say, okay, let's now do a rewrite to add en for that request so that that is then handled by the appropriate part of the application. And in so doing, we now have a default locale where English, for example, is showing at localhost 3000, and Dutch, if we were at this part of the application, would be showing here because we're at /NL. Okay, so our middleware complete. Let's go ahead and prove out our assumption here that we do in fact have the lang available in layout and in page. So we'll just do a quick console log here in layout, and we'll do a similar one in our boilerplate page. This is going to come in on params. Now let's check out our log. We'll reload the page here and see that I have made a mistake in the layout, which is to try and grab lang directly off of props instead of off of params. And now we see that our language is showing in both page and layout. Okay, let's continue. So we verified that our lang is available. Now let's create our dictionaries. We are going to add a new folder here in lang, call it dictionaries. And while we're at it, I'm just going to create another component that we'll be using soon called components. And one last addition here, dictionaries.ts. Okay, so in dictionaries, we're going to create our two files. And I'm going to skip over this. I just want to go over this in concept because it's time to get into actually building the application here. So the point is that there is a JSON file and it has the content of our two languages, English and Dutch in this case. And then we're going to create this here in this file, and it's going to complain at us. So we'll create these real quick. And let's jump back over because this is going to have a type issue. So for now, we'll just solve this with any, and then this is going to want to be a string. Okay, cool. We're in good shape there. Onward. So we want to go ahead and grab get dictionary in our page. And we want to invoke this and get our dictionary. We also need to make this async. Okay, so we don't actually have much in our dictionaries right now. They're looking a little empty. So I'm going to hold off on actually firing this off, and let's get to scaffolding out our content. All right, now that we've gone as far as the Next.js internationalization docs can take us, let's take a look at the application that we're going to be building. We have here a very simple e-commerce layout with a header, a locale selector, a couple of products, add to cart buttons, and a footer. And note that we can switch between locales by using our navigation here. So let's see how we build this. Okay, so let's just really quickly move our props up here, be a little bit more readable. And then we'll pass these. And then before we jump into actually making our layout, let's do one last optimization here. So we'll just add generate static params here to make sure that the application generates English and Dutch as params for our layouts. And so now we can go ahead and create the components for our application. We will start with main layout. And I'm just calling this main layout to distinguish it from layout as we're working in the editor here. And then we also want to create our header.tsx and our footer.tsx. Okay, so I'm just going to paste this in here because there's a good bit going on. So we get our dictionary, the current lang, we've typed those out to a certain extent, and then we are going to pass those to the div inside of the links here, And we're just going to do that little bit of styling that you saw where the non-current locale is going to be a little bit smaller. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. We pass in our sweet logo, and then we'll move on to the footer. And so here's our footer right now. It's pretty straightforward. Note that this text has not been translated. We will come back to that. Now that we have that, we can jump over to our main layout and we'll import our header and we'll import our footer. And then we're going to create our component. Okay, so here we're going to get a couple of props. We're going to get children, of course, this being a main layout. We're going to get our dictionary. We're going to get the lang. And then we will type that out. We're going to call it props. Children, another react.react node. Dict, we're leaving as any for the time being. Lang is a string. Okay, then for the markup, I'm just going to replace this div with one with a few Tailwind classes, and then we're going to pull in our header. And we'll pass the props that it needs, which are going to be dict and lang. Okay, and then we'll do a similar thing for the footer, but it doesn't need lang. And then we're going to have a div that wraps the rest of our layout, which looks like this. Okay, so our main layout is there. So now let's jump over to our page, which still has our starter content in it. So I'm going to uncomment these. We actually do want to get our dictionary now, and we need to get rid of this Next.js starter content. So we're going to create a div. So we're going to paste in here an h1 with a few Tailwind classes, and then we're going to do dict.products.catalog. And then we'll put in a new div here with a class name of flex, hfit, and gap of 6. And then now we need to create our product components. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to make product.tsx. We are going to need a button.tsx. Okay, and in our button.tsx, there's not a whole lot going on here. We just have some Tailwind classes, and then we use another translation key. So we'll save that, close that one out. Okay, and then we are going to need a little SVG for the icon that you saw in the layout so that we can import that here. And in product, we're going to import image, and we're going to import button, and we're going to import our image. Make our component, grab our props, type them out. ID is going to be a string. Okay, so we are going to just paste in a few lines of code here because there's a lot of CSS classes. So the gist of what's going on here is that we have an Next.js image with our image source, and then we grab a few more props, and we are passing the ID, which we got, which will select which product we're interested in, and then we have our button, which we saw a moment ago. Note that I have forgotten to translate the alt text here for the image, which, just speaking from experience, is really easy to do. So just try and keep an eye on that. Make sure you always include that. So we'll do it dot alt text. Okay, then we will come back to our page.tsx. We'll import product, pop that in here, and we have two products in our store. And so let's go ahead and use our component. But first, actually, before we do that, let's take a look at our layout. Let's see what our progress is. What's going on here? Well, we're calling our dictionary, but we don't have any created yet. So let's do that real fast. So I'm going to go over to dictionaries here, and this is where our translation content is going to go. English is just going to look like this, and Dutch is going to look like this. All right, so now we should be able to take a look at our content, and it's pretty straightforward, but we're getting there. Okay, now that we have all of our components created, we can go ahead and import our main layout and let's use it. So we'll wrap children with it. And then we need to pass a few components, or a few params rather. Alrighty, we should be looking better as soon as we grab the dictionary in our layout too, because of course we need it there as well. We will also need to make this layout async. Now we're kind of getting there. Let's add a few classes to the HTML. Actually, one class to the HTML, which is just going to make it the full height of the page, hfull, and we will extend the class that is currently on the body to add hfull there as well. Take another look. Boom. We got our full page layout. Now, let's make this a little more interesting. Okay, so let's make use of our product component now. We are going to need to pass it a couple of props. We're going to need our dictionary. We're going to need the ID rather. Which for the first one here, we're just going to do product one. Obviously, if this were an actual site, you wouldn't be coding this part up quite this way, but we aren't using an actual product catalog, so I think we can let it slide. Oh, I missed typing our params. Okay, all right, so, and we can get rid of the log here as well. Let's take another look at our layout. Hey, there we go. We're looking pretty good. Okay, so now we have the full functionality of our application. But this footer is actually still looking a little shabby. I don't know if you noticed it didn't translate when we switched languages. So let's come back to that. And we will finally use our dict here as well. So we're going to do dict.footer.allrights. And our footer's looking all right. Let's check out Dutch. What happened here? Well, let's look at what's going on. So while you weren't looking, I actually got rid of the translation for Dutch for the footer because I wanted to make this point that this is one of the weaknesses of this approach. If you forget to include a key, especially a nested one, for any given locale, your whole page, the whole view, is just going to explode on you. So it's definitely important to test if you are going to take this approach. There's also another weakness of this approach, which is, let's get rid of this log as well, that we have to pass our dictionary anywhere we want to use it. So we have to pass it from main layout to the header and the footer, and then we pull it in on the page as well. We grab our dictionary, we pass it to the product, and then we pass it to the button. Now, obviously, this is a pretty simple application, and maybe that's not terrible. Depending on what you're doing, this might be absolutely fine. But if you have many nested components, that can get tedious and hard to maintain, and tedious pretty quick. So that's something that we're going to be looking at in the next video. So let's go ahead and fix our Dutch translations. And okay, we're back in shape. All right, this is looking great. So we're just about ready to leave this here. I just want to make one final point, and that is that this entire application so far is using React Server components. We are using the new style of internationalization in Next.js, and so that's pretty exciting. We're using lots of the great new features of the app router and the most recent versions of Next.js. So we are going to want to take this quite a bit further though. For instance, let's have another look at our locale selection. We have 2 languages in here, and that may look okay for the time being, but what about when we want to add a 3rd language or 10 languages or more? This option is not viable. So obviously we're going to need something interactive here, which means using use client. And so we will also be getting into that in the next video. We have a pretty good starting point here. This is definitely the basics of internationalization in Next.js, but you can probably already feel it's pretty basic. And so you have to think about, in terms of putting your translations in these JSON files, what about when you have many locales? Or even more to the point, what about when you have many pages on a large site? Okay, maybe that's manageable. What about then when your layout changes or your client decides, or you decide if you're the client, you decide that you want to change everything. Well, that's going to be a pretty tedious, somewhat error-prone change for you or your dev team, which means that we're going to need a much more robust way to manage all of this. Now, we will start to get into that and much more in our next video. So make sure that you stick around for that. Subscribe, give us a like if this video was useful for you, and make sure you come for the rest of the series because there's really going to be a lot here, and our goal is that it helps as many people as possible. Thanks again, and we will see you next time.